Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some spring flower shop cards using the Simply Vintage Flower Shop collection from Spellbinders and Simple Stories. I have the flower cart die set as well as the scallop journal cards. And then I have the stitched dots and scallop border. There's one missing in that set. I have it set aside to die cut during my video. So I'm going to start out with embossing my background for my card. And I don't often do the background first. I'm not really sure why I did it here. Typically, I'll get my die cut pieces ready and then I'll start to assemble my cards and have everything ready to go. I'm using the Origami Folds Embossing folder, and I have a piece of hammermill cardstock here, and I center my piece of cardstock. It's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, but I'm going to be trimming it once it's embossed. I center it between the left and right of the pattern and the top and bottom of the pattern because I want it centered. I just like the way it looks a little bit better. Sometimes I don't necessarily do this if it's an all over pattern, but when it's something like this that's fairly geometrical, I find that it just looks a little bit better. I use my guillotine trimmer to trim that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And I have a piece of Plum Hero Arts cardstock here that is 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches glued to the back of my card. I'm gluing everything with some Barely Art glue, and I have it in a fine line bottle, perfect for backgrounds like this as well as gluing down my die cuts. Once that's on my card base, I set that to the side. I put an acrylic block on there just to make sure that everything is nice and flat and has good contact with the piece underneath. I have all my florals die cut here, and I have them die cut out of other Hero Arts cardstock. So I have Arctic, which is that light blue, Passion Flower, which is that purple, and then I have some beeswax cardstock, which is actually a Spellbinders cardstock. I don't have any yellow Hero Arts ones yet. I'm using some distress inks and some detailed ink blending brushes to just do a little bit of ink blending in the center of the flowers. It just gives them a little bit more floral or visual dimension. For the blue flowers, I use some tumbled glass. For the purple flowers, I used some wilted violet. And for those yellow flowers, I used some fossilized amber. Once I have those ink blended, and I do recommend using a sticky mat or something to hold your die cuts to do that, because it does make it a lot easier, especially with something tiny like this. Once that's done, I'm ready to start assembling my cards. For the centers of the flowers, I have some matte silver cardstock die cut from the Silver Treasured cardstock pack. You could also use something like Nouveau drops if you wanted to have silver in the center and have a little bit of a metallic touch with some dimension, or you could use some stickles if you wanted glitter there. This die set has the leaves all together, and it's really easy to know where they intend for you to put those flowers, but you can obviously change it up if you want. I did 2 of these pieces here, and I'm going to do them around on the top and the bottom of my scallop circle. I have some pre-made sentiments here that I did from a previous project and had left over. These are from the Bestie Sentiment press plate set, and they are embossed with silver embossing powder on hammermill cardstock before they're die cut, and they coordinate beautifully with the silver accents on the inside of each of those florals. My scallop circle is die cut out of that plum cardstock, so that ties in well with that center larger floral here. Now, this is technically a journal card, or that's what it is somewhat intended to be just from that, the name of the die set, but you don't necessarily have to use it as that. You could just use it as a scallop circle. There's 3 different sizes. I have the largest one here. You could also use a couple of the scallop circles to layer and have a little bit more color on your background, but I wanted to have that plum color, and I really wanted that to be the focal point and have that sentiment really pop off of there. For my beeswax flowers, I decided, or the small flowers, I decided to glue them on last. When I was doing my die cutting, I die cut extras of those, so I wanted to put the flowers where they were intended and then take those extras and just insert them in places that I thought they would look good or thought could use a little bit of extra color. So this is a great way, by putting this floral curve on the top and the bottom of the scallop circle, it's just a great way to make it look a little bit more like an oval. Now those tiny, tiny flowers didn't have a center to them. So rather than leave them on their own, I'm just using some Silver Nouveau drops just to give them that center, as well as give them that silver to coordinate with my sentiment as well as the other flower centers. Again, another option would be some silver stickles, and that would add a little bit of sparkle as well. So this is the finished card. The longest part of this card was the die cutting. The assembly, you could see how quick and easy it was. For my second card, I'm using the Flower Cart die set, and I have everything die cut and ready to go. The base of the top of my flower cut is die cut from ultra pink cardstock, and I'm putting the plum die cut over top of it, and I love the two colors of those together. My cart base is die cut from Portobello and Latte Cardstock, and having that 2 shades of brown gives it a little bit of extra detail. Another option would be to die cut it all out of the same shade of brown and then ink blend on one of them, just again, give it a little bit of visual dimension. It's really easy to know exactly where each one of those pieces go, and by gluing it with liquid glue, it gives you a little bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place and make sure that it's placed properly. I wanted to assemble my flower cart, the top separate from the bottom, so that when I put it on the front of my card, I could really figure out exactly where I wanted it to go and have a little bit of wiggle room for the posts between that top and the bottom to know exactly where I felt that they should go on the front of the card. For the centers of those wheels, I have those die cut out of the same matte silver cardstock that I die cut the flower centers for my first card. The sentiment here, I have it die cut out of that Plum Cardstock. It coordinates beautifully with the top of the flower cart. And that die set has 3 different choices for sentiments, and I love the fact that you do have those choices. With the top and the bottom assembled, I tucked that aside so that the glue could start setting. For the background for this card, and all my cards are A2 sized cards on white card bases. For the background for this one, I have some ultra pink cardstock die cut or trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4, and I have a piece of white cardstock here that is trimmed to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. Once I have that done, I can start putting my cart down. I can put the top down and then I put the bottom. However, I would recommend, if I were to do this again, putting the bottom down, putting the post in there, and then gluing the top, because you can always lower or raise that top depending on where you wanted it to sit. Here I put the top and then the bottom, but you can see when I go to put those posts in there, it's a little bit harder to tuck them underneath both pieces of the top and the bottom. And my piece of cardstock or my die cut for the top does come off of my card base because I keep pulling it up. So again, I'd recommend gluing the bottom down, then gluing the post, and then gluing that top canopy part of the flower cart. I have my floral die cuts already ink blended. It's exactly the same as my first florals, so I didn't feel that I really needed to do that on camera, and I have them ink blended out of the same colors as those first florals. This die set has 2 different floral clusters that you can choose. One looks a little bit like roses, and then one, in my opinion, looks like hydrangeas. That's the one that I have die cut with blue cardstock. And then it has some separate flowers, and that gives the cluster of flowers a little bit of extra dimension. The greenery base for those flower clusters were die cut out of some Kiwi cardstock and then lightly ink blended with some crushed olive cardstock just to give it a little bit of color variation, but you don't really see a whole lot of it. So the ink blending isn't necessary. I just like the way it looks. For my florals, to glue them on, I'm just using my fingers to curve those petals a little bit, again, giving it just a little bit more dimension. This is a step that you could skip if you didn't want to. Another option would be to use a stylus and an embossing mat, because these florals are quite tiny. I didn't find that they needed a whole lot of dimension, but I did want those petals to pop up a little bit. When gluing them down, I glued down ones kind of around the outer edges first, and then glued ones in the center so that it looked like the ones so that the ones on the outer edges would be behind the ones in the center, giving it a little bit more perspective, a little bit more dimension. For my yellow flowers here, I'm doing that same thing. When I'm gluing them down, I'm kind of covering up some of the green areas between the flowers. I'm not completely covering them. I want to see a tiny little bit of it, but I don't necessarily need to see that much green. So with them done, I can put them onto my card. Gluing the yellow ones down first, simply because I prefer blue rather than yellow. So I want the blue in the front and the yellow behind it. Again, gluing it with that Barely Art glue in the fine line bottle. Now, often when I glue die cuts down, I'll put an acrylic block on my card while they're drying. But because I added a little bit of dimension to those florals before gluing them down, I don't really want to flatten them. So I'm just gluing them down flat and my glue dries just fine. I added a little bit of stickles in the center of the card just to give it a little bit of extra sparkle. Makes those flowers really pop, and it catches the light when you tilt the card. For the centers of the wheels, I just added dots of the Silver Nouveau drops that I used for some of the smaller florals in my first card. Again, just to give it a little bit of dimension, a little bit of detail. With that done, I'm just going to let that dry while I complete my third card. For the third card, I'm using the tufted embossing folder, and just like the first one, I am centering it top to bottom as well as side to side to make sure that my embossed image is centered. Again, because it's geometric, you can tell if it's not, and I just like the look of it if it is. My piece of cardstock there was 4¼ inches by 5½ inches, and once that's done, I will use my trimmer to trim it down to 3¾ inches by 5 inches. For this card, I want to use that scallop border as a shelf for my little flower pots. And these flower pots are from the flower cart die set. So rather than using those clusters that I put on there, you could also use little pots with flowers. Now I am using that scallop die to create a shelf for my little pots to sit on. I used one of the pieces for the flower cart to create a ledge for the top of the shelf. Doesn't necessarily have to be done. And if you didn't do that, you could make your shelf longer than what I'm making it. I judged, or I chose the length of my shelf based on that die cut. So again, if you didn't use that die cut, you could easily lengthen your shelf if you wanted to, because it is fairly narrow. I glued the wood piece onto the top of the shelf and that just set that aside to dry. And those were die cut out of that same Portobello and Latte Cardstock that I die cut the bottom part of my floral cart for my second card. With my embossed background trimmed down here, I can glue those pieces to the base of the card. My mat here is trimmed from Arctic Cardstock, and it is 4 inches by 5¼ inches. Just centering that on the card base and then gluing down my embossed piece. Now, when you're gluing down embossed cardstock, it's always a good idea to be somewhat liberal with the glue, especially on the areas that are going to be touching that card base. You want to make sure that it's glued down nice and securely. While that is drying, I can assemble my buckets or my pails. I die cut them out of the same matte silver cardstock that I did the wheel centers for card number 2 and the flower centers for card number 1. And then I chose either the Latte or the Portobello, I don't remember which one, for the wood part of those handles. Now I'm using that same Barely Art glue. It's a liquid glue. If you happen to get some somewhere because they are on your fingers, or you don't necessarily place that die cut correctly and you get a little bit of glue where it's going to be visible, the easiest way to remove it is while the glue is still damp, using a damp cloth and just wiping it off that cardstock. When you use metallic cardstock, it has a little bit of a coating on it, so you're not going to soak the cardstock or ruin the cardstock by just rubbing it off. It makes it really easy to correct that, and that way you don't have those glue marks on the front of your bucket. You can see that I just did that there. I created 3 buckets because I want to have 3, or pails, because I wanted to have 3 floral clusters here. Put my shelf on my card, glued those pails on there, and then I already have my flower clusters completed. It's exactly the same as how I did it for card number 2, and the ink blending is exactly the same as the florals from card number 1. I could have showed it here, but I figured that was going to be a lot of repetition. For the pink flower cluster, they are die cut out of the Ultra Pink cardstock, and I did the ink blending for those with some picked raspberry distress ink. Once that is glued onto there, I'm using some stickles again for the centers of the flowers. I love having stickles in the center of the flowers. It gives that texture. It also gives that little bit of sparkle. You don't need a whole lot, just a tiny little bit. I typically judge the amount that I use based on the size of the florals. And then once again, I used another one of those sentiments from the Bestie sentiment press plate set that I already had left over from a previous card. This is a simple card to make, and a lot of these, or all of these, are good for using up cardstock scraps, because especially those florals, because they're not very big. So it's a great way to use some of those pieces up. So here are the 3 cards. We have our buckets of flowers on the shelf there. We have the flower cart, and then the first one with that scallop circle and the flowers on the top there. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know this was a short video, but with all the die cutting done ahead of time, they came together super, super quick. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.